I'm Kevin Power, and this is SaskScapes, the podcast featuring stories of arts, culture, and heritage in Saskatchewan. Welcome to episode 76 of SaskScapes. This episode is sponsored by SaskCulture. SaskCulture is a non-profit organization that helps nurture cultural engagement in Saskatchewan. Thanks to funding from the Saskatchewan Lottery's Trust Fund for Sport, Culture, and Recreation, SaskCulture is able to support many cultural groups that offer a wide range of cultural activities in communities throughout the province. For more information on all of the work being done by SaskCulture, as well as upcoming events including Culture Days, visit saskculture.ca and iheartculture.ca. Great news! Now you or your organization can sponsor your own episodes of SaskScapes. Connect with us via Twitter, Facebook, or email saskapes@gmail.com, and I'll be glad to tell you more. Now on to the episode. So tell me, how did the town or city you live in get its name? Was it named after someone? Does the name of your town reflect the geographical surroundings? And what about the people in your town? Who are the teachers, the elders, the story keepers? Who is that person that seems to be a walking encyclopedia on the history of your town? What I'm talking about here is culture. It's true. You have culture, so don't let anyone tell you otherwise. In this episode, I talk with Kristen Catherwood about the intangible aspects of our culture and heritage. These are the elements of our culture that don't require four walls. They don't live under a glass in a museum. Those are tangible things. But Kristen is passionate about intangible cultural heritage and has a very cool job traveling the province, meeting with people just like you and unmasking the layers and layers of the intangible aspects of you, your history, your folklore, your traditions, well, your culture. My next guest is a colleague of mine from last year. Kristen Catherwood was a community engagement animateur along with myself, and we met fairly early in the summer and had a fantastic 6 months doing our thing and traveling the province in separate directions, but always trying to keep in touch with what we were all up to. And then we all had this fabulous meeting at the end and got to hear about what everybody was doing in the communities in Saskatchewan. And it was at that time that I found out that Kristen has moved on to a new organization with a new title as the Intangible Cultural Heritage Development Officer with Heritage Saskatchewan, which is a very impressive title. Intangible cultural heritage is something that Kristen is very passionate about. She brought that to the province and the communities as an animateur and continues to do so now in her new position. Kristen, hello.
Hi, Kevin. Great to talk to you.
You too. Sorry we're not face-to-face. We are by telephone. So if there's a sound difference for listeners, that's why. And where am I finding you?
I am in Radville right now, which is about an hour and a half south of Regina, which is where I'm living currently, which is very close to where I grew up, which was on a farm near Ceylon, Saskatchewan.
Okay. You're not currently on a farm.
No, not at this very second.
Okay.
Though my heart it always is.
Right. Well, we share something else in common in that our hearts are also in another part of Canada. You studied on the Rock, as they say.
Yes, I did. I did my master's degree in folklore at Memorial University of Newfoundland in St. John's.
Right. Okay, so let's back up. You grew up in Saskatchewan. You had gone to university here before you went on to do your master's?
Yeah, I did my my bachelor's degree at the University of Regina, and I studied classics and medieval studies. And then I went on to Memorial after that.
Right. So we're going to focus on this intangible cultural heritage thing that everybody is talking about these days. And I was trying to think of how to ask you this question, and I thought, I wonder if it's silly to contrast what intangible cultural heritage is by talking about what tangible cultural heritage is first.
No, that is not silly. That's actually a great way to do it, especially because I can talk a bit about my own research to illustrate the point. So tangible heritage is often thought of as built heritage. That's kind of the traditional way of looking at heritage through buildings and also through the artifacts. And actually, when I did my thesis for my master's degree, I did it on barns in southern Saskatchewan, which are an example of tangible heritage. But in my research, I was looking at a tangible object, a building, which you can just study that. You can look at the building, you can look at how it was built, why it was built, what it was used for, and make a lot of deductions, and you can say a lot about the past and the present through looking at a building through the lens of tangible heritage. But I went a little bit further into it and looked at it as well through intangible cultural heritage, and that's where people's experiences really come into play and their the meaning. So my thesis ended up being about barns, but it was just as much about the barn as a symbol on the landscape as about it as a tangible object. And that's kind of one way to sort of introduce the subtle, well, not so subtle, but the nuances between tangible and intangible, because there's a lot of discussion and debate and within kind of the heritage sector about these different ways of looking at heritage. And my way is always to bring them together and realize that they're totally inseparable. You can't really study one without at least referencing the other. And it's just that over time, we put a lot of emphasis on buildings and artifacts, and sometimes the human element, the story behind them, was a little bit not necessarily lost, but we're bringing that story to the forefront and sort of enlivening the tangible landscape while also paying attention to things that maybe, because a tangible object or a building, it's there, right? You can see it, but there's a lot of knowledge within our historical and our heritage, our historical backgrounds and our heritage that isn't tangible, that isn't contained within an object or a building. And so intangible cultural heritage, as UNESCO defines it, aims to safeguard these types of knowledge, which don't have something physical to sort of hold them, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. Do you find that in your field that people's default mechanism is to think about our heritage with an object and kind of bypass the story behind the object? Or do you find that people really do say, well, that's an interesting object, but what's the story behind it?
Well, I think traditionally when we think of heritage, we think, okay, we go to a museum and we look at objects. And people are always interested in the story behind the object, but the object itself was the focus, I suppose. And that's why our museums all across, well, the world, but here in Saskatchewan, communities that have museums, they're full of stuff, right? And also when we talk about heritage organizations traditionally all across Canada, were concerned primarily with built architecture, with buildings. And so, yes, the default mechanism when you say heritage often is thinking about buildings or about artifacts. And the story is definitely contained within that, of course. But I think considering heritage as something that is not necessarily something that's solid and contained within a building and frozen in time, but rather something that is living. And that Heritage Saskatchewan, that's a term we use, is living heritage, to describe that heritage is not something that is just, because you can say take a teacup and, maybe it was from 1925. And you can talk about that teacup and its style and where it came from and what it's made out of. And that teacup is sort of frozen in time as what it is. Mm-hmm. But once you start talking about what that teacup means and how it was used over time and how it came to be where it is now, that's the intangible outside of the teacup. And that's living on to this day, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So that's one of the, I think, I don't know if the right term is revolutionary, about heritage right now in Canada and in Saskatchewan is going outside of that more traditional viewpoint of heritage as something to sort of be preserved or locked in time. Like, let's preserve this building in time. Let's preserve this artifact in time, which, don't get me wrong, that is still very important to be doing, but also realizing that heritage is more than just an object locked in time. Heritage is continually part of us. It's the past in the present, and it's what we take forward with us into the future, and it composes our identities. And now I'm getting a little further away from your question, but I hope that helps to kind of tease out some of the subtleties maybe within these definitions.
Right. Do we have a history in this country of preserving the story behind the object, or is this something that all of a sudden there's a real sense of urgency and emphasis being put on the story, the oral traditions, the social practices, the rituals, all of those things? Do we have a history of wanting to preserve those things?
We definitely do. And I mean, the fact that we have stories at all still, obviously, people pass those down automatically and naturally. But maybe one way I can try to put this in perspective is, and this is how I would describe it when I'm, say, doing a workshop or something, and maybe I'll back up just a little bit, and I'll define what intangible cultural heritage is according to UNESCO, and then I'll talk about that a little bit more. So UNESCO defines intangible cultural heritage as traditions or living expressions inherited from our ancestors and passed on to our descendants, such as oral traditions, performing arts, social practices, rituals, festive events, knowledge and practices concerning nature and the universe, or the knowledge and skills to produce traditional crafts. So we talk about UNESCO, which there is a convention for the safeguarding of intangible heritage, which was drawn up over a decade ago now. And the reason for that convention coming into being, or one of the reasons, is that when you think of UNESCO and you think of, say, a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and we have several of those in Canada, though we don't have any in Saskatchewan, though I know Wanuskewin is now wanting to get that designation. But say, for example, one of the UNESCO World Heritage Sites in Canada is the Head Smashed In Buffalo Jump near Lethbridge, Alberta.
Right.
So that is a place you can go. And there are tangible objects that archaeologists have unearthed that you can go there and you can see those objects. You can be in the landscape, and it is a place you can go. Mm-hmm. And there's places like that all over the world, and there's museums and there's artifacts and there's buildings all over the world that you can go to and sort of experience heritage by being in a place or by interacting with an object. And then as time went on, scholars and people in the heritage world realized, there's a lot of our human heritage, our cultural expression, that isn't being safeguarded the way that we can safeguard a physical location or an object. We can't put it in a glass case and keep it for posterity. And that is what I was just talking about, people's customs and rituals and their ways of speaking. And at this point, this is in the early 2000s, of course, that there's been this real technical revolution in our world and modernization and globalization. And a lot of these intangible material was at risk because you couldn't put it in a glass case and you couldn't kind of put a fence around it and say, this is preserved. This is a World Heritage Site. So that's part of the reason why this convention was drawn up, was to recognize, first of all, the importance of this kind of material, and then put in place a strategy for helping to not necessarily preserve it, but to perpetuate it so that it continues to be a part of people's lives, and they're continuing to pass it down as they have been for thousands and thousands of years, going back into, the mists of prehistory, which humans have always done, is pass down their knowledge, their ways of doing things, their ways of interacting with the environment around them. And so that's why. So when you ask, is this a new thing? It isn't really. It's just maybe the language to talk about it and the toolbox to actually work with it is different. And there is this UNESCO convention has a series of 4 goals to help communities and individuals and organizations and nations to safeguard this intangible cultural heritage.
Mm-hmm. Do you find that in your travels, do you find that there's a certain demographic that is perhaps more open and responsive to this concept, and then another demographic that perhaps, well, I don't want to stereotype by saying a younger demographic that is so influenced by quick sound bites, YouTube videos of cats flushing toilets and things like that, and we're talking about things that have certainly been part of generations in the past. I know I've spent so much time in seniors' homes in the last few years, and of course, any senior citizen, especially, veterans of the war, will be more than happy to talk about their heritage and their rituals and their stories. Do you find that same kind of passion is being passed on to a younger demographic?
That's one of the main, I think, issues and challenges. And I primarily deal in smaller communities and rural communities. That's really my focus in my work. And so when I go into a smaller community, often one of the main issues they have when it comes to any kind of cultural or heritage work in their community is that their committees or boards often are made up of an older demographic. And they are wondering, how are we going to attract younger people? Not just younger people, but a more varied group of people onto our committees, because as we know in Saskatchewan, our population is really changing. We have a lot of newcomers. We have a growing First Nations and Métis community. And so how do we bring a more diverse group of people into our communities? And how do we perpetuate? Because you're right, you go into the museum and often the people on the committee might be older people, senior citizens, and they're justifiably worried about continuing this on after they've, passed away or retired or whatever. Who's going to continue this on? And so that's one of, my goals when I go into community is thinking about how to attract youth and more diverse members of the community, not even just youth, but even just younger people in their 30s and their 40s to join some of these committees that are responsible for curating the heritage and the culture in any given community. But when you asked about, are there any demographics that respond more to this, I find that when I go into a community, that depending on who's, say at the workshop or the presentation, it really speaks to all ages, the questions that I'll ask or the activities that we'll do, every single person. And that's often what's really exciting for me is to see how much people are engaged by talking about their own intangible cultural heritage and realizing that we all have this. It's not just people who are interested in, museum objects or heritage buildings or, that every single person possesses this intangible cultural heritage, this knowledge, and seeing people get excited about that is really, for me, fulfilling. But it's sometimes the challenge is to get those people in the room in the first place and to get them talking about it. Because usually when you do first begin working in a community, I always say, I know I'm preaching to the choir, but I'm teaching you a new song perhaps, or reminding you of a song that you sort of forgot about. And now you're like, oh, that's right. So, and there's also a difference too between working with when I'm working with, say, a community of First Nations people, I don't have to necessarily explain what intangible cultural heritage is, because they have a much more richer oral culture, I think. They generally, I don't have to say, this is what intangible cultural heritage is. Whereas sometimes in communities where I'm working with people who come from more of a settler background, I sometimes have to be a little bit more to remind them that you do have culture, because sometimes I'm always surprised that sometimes people think that they somehow don't have culture because, I'm just from a small town in Saskatchewan. We don't really have culture here. We have history, and they'll talk a lot about the pioneer days or the war, which is important, but that's not the only story. And I'll say, but there's heritage all around you, and you're carrying heritage with you all the time. It doesn't matter if you're 5 years old or if you're 95. You're carrying that intangible cultural heritage around with you. So that's one of the challenges, I guess, is to sometimes just draw that out of people. And some people do sort of have a better understanding of it, but it doesn't take long before almost anyone realizes it.
Hey, it's Kevin. I hope you're enjoying the episode so far. Just a quick reminder that the SaskScapes podcast is available for free on your favorite podcast app, or you can stream it from your browser. Check out the show notes for the link. On the SaskScapes homepage, you'll notice something new under the logo called SaskScapes Plus. You can't miss it. There's a big button saying support with a heart icon next to it. I'd love it if you could click on that button and help keep this podcast series going. When SaskScapes launched in May 2014, it was the first podcast in the province celebrating arts, culture, and heritage. In fact, you'd have been pretty hard-pressed to find any Saskatchewan podcasts. So I'd like to think that we paved the way. It's been because of your support that this podcast is now in its 9th year. Okay, that's it. Enjoy the rest of the episode. Right. Do you think that people think they don't have culture because they associate things like within their community? Well, to have culture, we would have to have a theater, and we would have to have specific music groups and a gallery. And is that what they tend to think culture is?
Yeah, that's one way. In fact, last year I was meeting with a woman, and she said, well, we'd like you to come to our community, but I don't know if it would be worth your while because we just don't have any culture here. We don't have, exactly what you're saying. We don't have a theater. We don't really have any musicians or artists. And I said, stop right there, That's not the only story of what culture is. And another thing, and this is, I can use an example from my own experience, like when I was growing up in southern Saskatchewan on a farm, and I was obsessed with, history of other places. And I sort of thought, there's no culture and there's no history in Saskatchewan, And I thought places like Newfoundland had culture. And that's, places like Newfoundland have culture. Places like Quebec, you see things on TV and you see people doing traditional dances or whatever. You think in Europe, or you look at, or even First Nations people, you think, well, they have culture, but we don't. We're just kind of boring people here in a small town, and we don't have culture like that. And then when I went away and started actually studying folklore, I just remember thinking, oh my God, we have so much culture. It's just, we take it for granted because it's our everyday experience. And so we just think, whatever, this is just the way we live, without necessarily thinking that the way we live isn't the way that everyone lives. And the things that we value and our beliefs that we have and our ways of expressing ourselves are very much local to us here and wherever we are in Saskatchewan, because it's not the same across Saskatchewan either. It's completely, from town to town, it changes from region to region. There's so many ways of expressing our cultural backgrounds that we just totally take for granted. And I'll throw out a few examples just that are coming off the top of my head, like, for instance, a fall supper. I think a lot of us here in Saskatchewan take a fall or a fowl supper for granted. We think, doesn't everyone have fall suppers? And no, not everyone does. And are you from the East Coast? Did you have fall suppers growing up in Nova Scotia?
No, not that I can recall.
Not the way that we have them here, not in that sort of traditional sense.
No, we would. They weren't seasonal. I mean, there were always potluck gatherings, and of course, there's always the famous kitchen parties. But I can't think of something. I would think that here, fall suppers would be very much influenced by harvest time.
Absolutely. And the fact that, I can give you from my personal, my community here, we have two fall suppers in Radville, the United Church and the Catholic Church. And the Catholic Church serves a certain dish every year, and the United Church serves a certain, whether it's turkey or roast beef. And I remember a few years ago, and this is long before I even studied folklore, but I was, my friend who was from Medina invited me to her community's fall supper. And I thought, okay, that'll be fun. And I thought, I wonder if they're going to have roast beef or turkey. And we get there, and it wasn't that. It was like sausage and homemade pierogies and cabbage rolls. And for me, that was totally exotic. I was like, oh my gosh, I can't believe you're eating this at a fall supper. This is so amazing. It's like mosaic. But for her, in her community, that was just normal, because in that area, a lot of the settlers came from Eastern Europe. Whereas down where I lived, there weren't so many. So we had, turkey and roast beef. And just even those little things, those are examples of, well, why do you have pierogies at your fall supper? And the fact even that they're homemade. And I remember once being in a community this past summer, and we were talking about fall suppers, and they were saying how, back in the past, there have been several churches in the community, and how there have been a lot of division amongst the various churches, and people didn't always kind of see eye to eye or even associate too much with each other. And she said, but that's changed now. Now the Greek Orthodox ladies, they'll go over and they'll pinch pierogies with the Ukrainian Orthodox ladies. And I thought that was so wonderful. And I thought pinching pierogies isn't even a term I would have ever used in my life. That's not something I'm familiar with.
Right.
Because in my particular neck of the woods, that's just not something that's part of our cultural heritage. But in that part of Saskatchewan, it is. And those are the little things that at first you don't think of as cultural, because that's just what you do. It's just your life. But of course, it is very much cultural.
Right. Tell me.
And it is very much heritage, too, because it's passed down. Where did you learn to pinch pierogies from, you learned that probably from your mother and your grandmother. And where did she learn it from? It's this knowledge that's passed down over time.
Tell me, when you set out to study folklore and then later on went on to do your master's, what had you thought you might wind up doing with your degrees, and how does that differ from what you're doing now? How has your career path evolved and been influenced by where you've wound up now?
Well, I'll tell you that when I was growing up, I mentioned before, I thought, we don't have any culture in Saskatchewan. We don't have any history in Saskatchewan, right? And that's why I studied classics and medieval studies. And I just assumed I would end up somewhere else in the world and I'd be teaching classical history or medieval history. And then I had some great professors at the U of R who said, just so you know, jobs are few and far between, and just made me think about expanding your horizons. And I just stumbled across the folklore program in Newfoundland. I knew nothing about it. I didn't really know what folklore was. To be perfectly honest, I simply followed kind of my guts in that, and I just kind of went. I applied for the program. I thought it looked intriguing, and I was accepted, and I just sort of decided to go, having really no idea what to expect. And I thought, well, if I hate it, I'm coming home in a month. And if it's I just really didn't know. And I got out there, and within a couple days of starting to learn about what folklore was, I thought, this is what I was meant to do with my life. And I had no idea. And as for career, when I first started, I really didn't know what I might end up doing. I just I honestly can't say that I had much of a plan. I just sort of, like I said, was following my guts there. And then once I got more ensconced in the program, and I looked, Newfoundland has they have an Intangible Cultural Heritage Development Officer as well, Dale Jarvis, who's a folklorist, and he works through the Heritage Foundation of Newfoundland. And they have obviously a folklore department at Memorial University. And I could see, some of the people who'd gone before me in the program who had various jobs in the province. And I hoped, and I knew right away as soon as I started studying, that I wanted to come back to Saskatchewan and do folkloric work here. And honestly, if I could have built my own job, I probably would have created the job that I have right now with Heritage Saskatchewan.
Great.
So I feel very lucky and fortunate that I have this opportunity right now, because that's exactly, if I'd been told I would have this chance when I was in university, I would have just been over the moon, because it's pretty much exactly what I wanted to do, which is to work with communities to, empower them to tell their own stories, to empower them to curate their own heritage, and also to be able to explore this amazing place we live in and discover all of the incredible stories that are out there, and unearth this amazing folklore or intangible cultural heritage or living heritage, which have slightly different meanings, but they all encompass the same material. And to be able to go out in the province and explore it all the time. That's just, that's exactly what I hoped I would be able to do. So I'm very, very lucky to be where I am right now.
I grew up in the Maritimes, as you know, and folklore is very near and dear to my heart. And it just occurs to me when you were talking about how you were influenced by the folklore of the Maritimes, that I wonder, within the context of intangible cultural heritage and as it pertains to folklore, does it really matter? Because I think of some of the stories that I grew up hearing. I remember the stories of the haunting of a mansion in Halifax County called Halliburton House, and I think about the folklore behind the statue of Evangeline looking out over the ocean in Church Point. And some of these things were true. Some of them were yarns that were spun. Some of them started off with a kernel of truth, but then expanded because everybody loves a great storyteller, and what better thing to do than to expand on your story and embellish it a bit. So within intangible cultural heritage, does accuracy matter, I guess is the question I'm asking.
That's a good question. Sometimes I get into little arguments with people who are more historically minded over these very things, and I'll grab at you mentioned Evangeline, the famous Acadian heroine of the great, or the I'm thinking of the French term, but when all the Acadians were deported from Nova Scotia, and that figure, whether she was a real person or not, whether she really did get separated from her lover, my question is, does it matter if she was real or not? Mm-hmm. And the historian might say, well, of course it does. And that's fine. But my argument as a folklorist would be, it's not necessarily the person itself, it's what that person represents. What does that story tell us? And to bring it back home a little bit more, how about I'll do, and you've heard this story before, Kevin, and lots of people have now, but this is the story I always use to illustrate this point, and I'll just tell it quickly. And this is a local story, a little bit of local folklore. So down in the Big Muddy, where you're more likely to run into a cactus than a cottonwood tree, there are millions of years of geological time revealed in the exposed hillsides and buttes. Down in the Big Muddy, the only shelter from the scorching summer sun or the bitter winter wind is down in the coulees. Now, down in the Big Muddy, there is a line. Some call it the medicine line. Some call it the 49th parallel. Some simply refer to it as the border. Whatever you want to call it, it is invisible on the landscape, but it is real nonetheless, for it slices the Big Muddy Valley in two, so that part of it is there in the United States, in Montana, and part of it is here in Saskatchewan, in Canada. Now, that line for some was a division, a barrier between two peoples, two places, two ways of life. But for others, it was an opportunity. This is about 100 years ago, and I'm talking about certain fellas who had names like the Pigeon-Toed Kid, and Dutch Henry, and Sam Kelly. And what they would do is they would rustle up some cattle and horses from the Canadian side of the border. They'd drive them down across that line. They'd sell them to a rancher in Montana, spend a couple of days in the local saloon, turn around, steal back the same cattle and horses, and perhaps a few besides, drive them back up across that line and sell them back on the Canadian side to some other rancher, thus making two profits off one prize. Now, sometimes, of course, they got into a bit of trouble and they had some pursuit. Now, luckily, the Big Muddy, which is Badlands, was a great place to either hide from an enemy or make a run for it. So sometimes they'd hide in caves and sometimes they'd make a run for it. And one way they would do this is they would ride down to the shores of Big Muddy Lake, which was an alkaline lake, so it wasn't safe to cross. But down by the shore of this lake, there lived a wild roan mare. And this mare knew the way across the lake that was safe. And so when these people came galloping over those hills with their horses and their cows, the roan mare would spook and she'd take off across the lake and they'd follow her. And by the time they got to the other side, whoever was pursuing them was so far behind that they couldn't get across. They didn't know where it was safe. The roan mare was long gone, and they had to go all the way around the lake, a distance of more than 20 miles. And so then, of course, the outlaws had got off scot-free once again. So that story, which you could call the legend of the roan mare, was told to me by a rancher in the Big Muddy Valley, which is just not too far from where I am right now in Radville. And that story, I always ask people, is it true? And you'll have people say, oh, maybe it is, or maybe it's, no, I don't think so, or I think it is. And then I'll ask, does it matter if it's true? I'll let you think on that. But if you want, you can drive down into the Big Muddy, and if you know the right gravel road, there's a signpost, and it says on it, Roan Mare Coulee, and it's named for one of the coulees, which goes into that Big Muddy Lake. So that name comes from something, and that Roan Mare, that legend, comes from somewhere. I can't tell you if that Roan Mare is real or not. I don't know if she ever existed. I don't know if she ever led any outlaws on the run across the lake. I don't know if Dutch Henry or the Pigeon-Toed Kid, ever actually did make their getaway across that lake. But I can tell you that Dutch Henry and the Pigeon-Toed Kid were real people. Those are aliases for real men, that there really was cattle rustling that went down in the Big Muddy, that they really did use that border to make two profits off one stolen herd. So there's a lot of truth in that story, even though the story itself might not actually be factually true. It contains a lot of truth. And that's the thing about folklore and intangible cultural heritage is when we're talking about folk tales or even songs or riddles or talking about historical characters like Louis Riel, there's so many songs and ballads and stories about Louis Riel which may or may not actually be true historically, but they still contain truth. And there's a reason why people continue to tell these stories. Like that rancher who told me the story of the wild roan mare. Why would he tell me that story? What's the point of telling me that story if it's not true, for instance, which he probably doesn't know if it's true or not either. The reason he tells it to me is because it says something about the place where he's from. And in so doing, it tells me something about him because we're very much products of the place of which we're born and raised and call home, whether we're born and raised there or not. And so the stories we tell about places, the names we give to places, all contain a lot of meaning. And so when you ask, does it matter if it's true? For my purposes as a folklorist, it really doesn't. What matters is the meaning and what it tells me about people's identities and their connections to place. And there certainly is a place for historical accuracy, of course. But in terms of intangible cultural heritage in my work, it's really not as important as listening to what people have to say and asking them what it means to them and what it says about them as people and their cultural identities.
And what I've observed when I've been with you telling that story with groups is it also ignites a greater conversation as people begin to recall similar kinds of legends and folklore in their own experience growing up, so that I'm sure even now as you continue to travel the province, you're finding people opening up about things that they knew, stories that they were told from their past that they haven't thought about for a long time, and in hearing that story makes them all of a sudden remember that?
Absolutely. I was just doing a presentation in Prince Albert a couple weeks ago with people from the Northern District for Sports and Culture. So it's people from all across northern Saskatchewan. And I told them that story. And for people from the north, and even people from even like around Regina and Saskatoon area, the Big Muddy that's not a familiar landscape to them. That's not something that is part of their cultural heritage, right? So in the north, when I talk about coulees, and I was asking someone, said, do you know what a coulee is? And a lot of them weren't familiar with that term, a coulee. And then that got us talking about what are some things in the north that are particular to the north. And we talked about things like muskeg, which till last year, I personally, if you'd asked me what muskeg was, I wouldn't really have known because it wasn't part of my own cultural heritage, my own background, right? So even these words for geographical features, which we may kind of take for granted in wherever we live, might be completely alien to someone, even within our own province. So like you said, that story, even though it wasn't really relevant necessarily to people in the north, it definitely got people talking about what are our own stories. And one young man told me a wonderful story about the Northern Lights and how when he was a kid, you go outside and they were warned as children by the adults that don't whistle or the northern lights will come down and steal you away, which I thought that's an amazing piece of folklore right there. So.
Wow. Hey, it's Kevin. Just a quick reminder that SaskScapes is a free download, no matter where you find us. SaskScapes has its own app for both Android and Apple devices, and that app can be found in the Apple App Store and Google Play. You can find us on iTunes, Stitcher Radio, SoundCloud, and Libsyn, as well as many of the other popular podcasting sources. If you like what you're hearing, your comments and star ratings help boost the series in the podcast rankings, so I'd love to hear from you. Okay, let's get back to the podcast. Okay, here's a deep, profound concept for you. We're talking about tradition, we're talking about the past, but I wonder if we're constantly creating intangible cultural heritage in the moment now as we live today. Because eventually today will be the past. And so the way we move through life right now, are we constantly creating the intangible cultural heritage of our lives?
Absolutely. We're creating, but we're also recreating, and we're taking these bits and pieces that are passed down to us over the years, and we take what is meaningful to us, and that's what survives, is what's meaningful to us. And we attach that meaning into our present circumstances, so we make it relevant for the time we're living in now. And I suppose that's part of the reason for, this UNESCO Convention on Safeguarding is how do we make sure that this information and this knowledge can still be relevant in our world that we live in today, which is, a lot of this traditional knowledge may not seem useful for a lot of people anymore. So yes, we are constantly taking that. And even, like the story about the roan mare, for instance, like that happened, if it happened, about 100 years ago. So that's actually a fairly new legend because, if you go to, say, Newfoundland or Europe or other parts of the world, some of these legends have roots going back centuries, But this particular story I told is about 100 years old. But still, it's 100 years old. There might still be people rustling cattle down in the big muddy, but it's not the way it was, 100 years ago with the outlaws going back and forth across the border and everything. But why is it still relevant today? Like, why would that rancher tell me that story today? And like I said, it says something about the place. And even though that kind of activity isn't happening anymore today, it's still kind of saying, like, this place you see now, it might look kind of calm on the surface, but, there's this sort of this Wild West underlying this place. And when you're out there and you're amongst those buttes and there's cacti all around you and stuff, you can see that. And so even though it's not necessarily that story doesn't really have any relevance necessarily for today, it's not like a practical guide on how to be a successful rancher or something. Mm-hmm. It's still a relevant story to people's identities. But when we're talking about things that are more, for instance, like knowledge for how to do something like, say, pinching pierogies, or even when I was in PA a couple weeks ago, we're talking about local knowledge and how important it is for knowing, how to hunt. And even how to do things like, where are the berries? If you're going to go picking berries, where's the best places to find berries? And that kind of information, people hold that in their memories and their minds. And if you don't pass it on, it gets lost. And so that's why sometimes it is difficult to, for some people, there's that fear that that's going to be lost, I guess. And that maybe at some point in the future, these stories won't be remembered anymore. This knowledge will be lost. And maybe at some point in the future, we'll need that knowledge again. So sometimes I think we need to kind of go back to your question. Part of my work, almost honestly, is to not artificially, but to kind of encourage that recreation of intangible cultural heritage, to sort of keep it going. Whereas in the past, you didn't really have to worry about it. It just took care of itself. And I do still believe that it does still take care of itself, but that sometimes in our present culture, just because our society has changed so quickly in the past few decades, that right now we need maybe a little bit of a nudge to keep us creating that intangible cultural heritage and passing it down and making it relevant for us now in the 21st century.
Well, it was certainly the impetus behind me creating the podcast series 2 years ago was the fact that I thought, my gosh, there are so many stories out there, and not everybody gets a book written about them. And what happens to them when we lose the people? Where do the stories go? And I thought, well, in my own little way, I'd hope that, putting these podcasts on the internet for the world to hear is a way of perpetuating those stories and keeping them alive.
It absolutely is. And in fact, I mentioned the 4 goals of the UNESCO Convention for Safeguarding Intangible Cultural Heritage earlier, and the first goal is documentation. Mm-hmm. So that's exactly what you're doing with these podcasts, and that's so important, and that's the first thing when I'm in a community. We talk about documentation and how can we do that? And recorded interviews is one of the number one tools in the folklorist toolkit is the oral history and the recorded interview, so it's very important. And I'm really happy to be part of your documentation right now.
Tell me, how does time and how does distance influence our intangible cultural heritage? Because I think it seems that it would. I mean, the amount of time it would take to travel, the distance, and what it meant then versus now. You wrote about that recently.
Did you just read my most recent blog post?
I did.
Okay, good. I was like, this is either uncanny or you've read it.
No, I read it. It's not entirely original, but I wanted to sound like it was something I just thought about now. But in fact,
I burst your.
That's all right. No, you wrote about it, and I read it.
Yes, and I definitely can be more articulate in my writing. So definitely check out my blog post on the Heritage Saskatchewan website where I write about these things. Because, yes, time and distance and space have a huge effect. And again, we were talking about what does it mean, culture, what's culture, and how everyone's cultural. And just think about how we tell time and how we might think, well, that's the way we tell time. But it's not the way that necessarily everyone tells time. We have our New Year on January 1st, but not every culture in the world has their New Year on January 1st. And our calendar right now, runs, it's a solar calendar basically, but there's also the lunar calendar. And sometimes, people who live in rural areas, we follow the calendar that, well, I know I have a doctor's appointment on April 4th, and, I have to be somewhere at 1:30 p.m., and there's that kind of time, this sort of linear time. But then there's also a cyclical time, which people who live close to the environment and close to nature are very much aware of, even if we don't always think about it or talk about it. It's deeply ingrained in who they are and how they go about their lives, and that's people who are in the agricultural industry as farmers and ranchers, people who are hunters and trappers are very much attuned to this cyclical time, which is, seasonal, and it's based on and phases of the moon and the time that the sun sets and the sun rises. And that's a time that's just as relevant as the linear calendar time. And that also it's cultural. How we use that time is cultural. So that's kind of a vague description right now, but I would encourage anyone who's interested in these kind of concepts to look at those blog posts and distance too. How do we measure distance? In the province right now, the Saskatchewan we know right now is laid out in a very precise kind of form of measurement, which was based on the imperial system of miles. And that's when you go in the country, people talk about things being a mile or a quarter of a mile, and that's partly kind of a holdover. That's a bit of intangible cultural heritage that people continue to use the imperial system, despite the fact that we've technically been measured for decades. Yeah. But it's also because it makes more sense, not because a mile naturally makes more sense than a metric kilometer, though some people might argue about that, but because the way that our province right now has been laid out, the way that, a section of land is a mile long. So when you look at roads, when you look at where buildings are placed, all of those things are based on this system. So to try and just put kilometers on top of that, it just doesn't even make sense in the country, really. And two, when you look at the old trails before the settlers came, before the railroad came in, of course, now we're very much grids. We have straight highways and straight roads, and things meet at X's most of the time, and we sort of correct for the curvature of the earth with correction line grids and that sort of thing. But if you look at the old trails, those, of course, didn't follow straight lines. They followed the landscape in the way that made the most sense. So they went where there was water or shelter, or where the way was, flatter or easier, or the shortest distance between two places. Mm-hmm. So there's these older ways of measuring distance, and even the way we talk about it, like as the crow flies. What does that mean to say that? Oh, well, it's 3 miles as the crow flies, but it's 8 miles if you take the roads, right? So, and in a place like Saskatchewan, which is so vast, distance has a huge impact on our daily lives, and something that we take for granted, that places are far away. But when you go to other parts of the world, I was in the UK a couple of years ago, and I was talking to a local and saying, oh, yeah, I'm going up to York for the weekend, mm-hmm. which was a 3-hour train ride from London, which is where I was near. And she said, why would you go all the way up there? That's so far, for that distance or for that time, you might as well fly to Portugal. Right. And she thought, it was just, why would you spend 3 hours going to York? That's the other side of the country. It's just, she couldn't even fathom that. And I said, 3 hours? That's like going from Regina to Saskatoon. It's nothing to go 3 hours. But in the UK, that is literally going basically from one end of the country to another. And there's different as night and day in some regards. So,
and how we travel those 3 hours now, and how people traveled those 3 hours in, say, 1800 was vastly different.
Yep. And in this blog post I recently wrote, I talk about, Weyburn, which is our nearest sort of city, I guess, and it's where most people have to haul their grain now, since we don't have elevators anymore in the small communities here. Back when my great-grandfather was farming, he had to take the grain to Weyburn, and it was a 3-day trip, and he would sleep under the wagon. And now it's 45 minutes by car, maybe an hour and some if you're taking a load of grain. So Weyburn has always, it's always been kind of the closest major center for us here. But 3 days and 45, well, I guess an hour and a half round trip is a pretty big difference.
Right.
But it's the same distance, so.
I was reading on the UNESCO website, I don't know how this, perhaps you can speak to how this ties into intangible cultural heritage, but I was reading this I thought it was quite a beautiful concept, the concept of a living national treasure, or a living human treasure, mm-hmm. a title awarded to a person or a group, who's regarded a national treasure while they're still alive. I love mm-hmm. that concept.
Yes, and that's, in folklore, we often use the term tradition bearers to talk about people who contain a lot of wisdom and knowledge. And in First Nations culture, they refer to these people as elders. Mm-hmm. And it's the same idea. Someone who has, though there's a little different connotation for elders in terms of a spiritual sense. But yeah, like a living treasure, that would be someone who's a tradition bearer, someone who contains this knowledge. And every community has at least one of these people who just know, things. And that's kind of what I do in my spare time, is I seek out these types of people, and I'll do interviews with them mm-hmm. about, sometimes about specific subjects. Like, for instance, I did an interview not too long ago with a fellow from Ceylon here, Mr. Albert Hansen, who's a rancher, and talked to him specifically about ranching and cowboy culture in the Big Muddy Valley. I also have interviewed another local woman, this is Elise Bernard, who's 97 this year, and I talked to her for several hours about and she's someone who's like, I was a housewife, and I lived within about a 10-mile radius my whole life, and I don't really know much, is what she said when I first asked her to interview her. And of course, then I had several hours, because basically, someone like Mrs. Bernard she has a PhD in her local environment, basically. She's from the RM of Norton, so we could say she has a PhD in the RM of Norton. So she's lived there for nearly 100 years. So she knows so much about that place, and she's, I'll ask people about the weather. I'll say, do you ever remember a winter as mild as this one? Or do you ever remember, a spring as dry as this? And they can reach back into their memory and talk about things and have wisdom for us. And if we just would listen, they can teach us things about the landscape from their own experience, and not just their own, but also having heard from their parents. They have this knowledge that is contained within them that if they're willing to open themselves up to sort of being tapped for that knowledge, can be very relevant to us today and very important for us.
You would literally never run out of stories to tell. No.
Sometimes I lay awake at night because I think, how can I possibly explore all the things I want to explore right here in this province, much less, all around the world or even all around Canada. It's completely endless. And yeah, I do sometimes think, geez, there's so much here, and I wish that I could just bring in an army of folklorists to just descend upon Saskatchewan and sort of tease out all of these wonderful stories and document them, and keep them safe.
Well, it sounds like you're charged with the mission of really exciting people about telling these stories to each other and bringing communities together by swapping stories. I remember when we met in Yorkton, and you asked everybody at the table the story behind how their town got the name that it did, and just how that conversation flourished. And, there was hesitancy at the beginning, and people kind of thought, I don't know if I want to speak up. And by the end of it, people just they couldn't shut up. They were thinking about all kinds of things, about what possibly the legend behind the name of their town was, or it could have been this, or, I don't actually know, but all of a sudden I care that I would like to know what the story is. You must find that very rewarding.
I do, and I love that, and I've done enough of those now to appreciate sometimes, someone say, well, I'm not sure if we'll have much here for you, or I don't know if people are going to get into it. And I just say, don't worry, because the stories, once you just start asking those questions, the stories just come out, and people, as soon as people can relate themselves to their place in the world and kind of look at it from a slightly different perspective than they ever have before, you can just see this energy, and you can feel the energy in the room. And you're right, you start out and it's kind of, people are a little shy, not sure if they want to talk, and sort of maybe a little bit skeptical and thinking, oh, whatever, heritage is boring, or, I don't really want to talk about that, or, there's only so much we can say about our old, museum or whatever. But when you start asking questions that are just a little bit different, suddenly you can feel that energy come alive in the room. And that is, I've always, every community I visit, I'm just get so excited myself being in that room, but also by seeing other people's excitement begin once they start thinking, geez, I never thought of that before. I never really thought about how maybe that's something that's really important to us, or maybe we could use that in some way. And that's another part of, my challenge, is not to just get people engaged in thinking about heritage in a different way, but also, okay, now we've unearthed all of this amazing and interesting information, and we've started to realize how many stories there are. How can we actually use that now? How can we sort of harness that and use it for something that will be beneficial in our community? How can we continue to connect people and engage with people? And so that's sort of the next challenge, once we've sort of tapped into that, is to, okay, now what do we do with all this information? And that's not up for me to tell a community, it's up for me to kind of give them suggestions or ideas, but it's a community's job to figure out for themselves what their stories are, what's important to them, and how they can use that, whether it's in an existing museum, whether they want to create something new like an eco-museum or an interpretive tour or even a booklet, or they just decide, you know what, we're going to go out and we're going to do some documentation, we're going to interview some of our community's tradition bearers. Whatever a community decides is within their means to do. But my job is just to go and sort of encourage them to do that. Like I said earlier, to curate their own heritage and to tell their own stories, just by asking a few questions. So really, in a way, I have the easiest and most exciting job in the whole world.
It's a very cool gig. You're very lucky.
Yes, and I don't take it for granted. I'm grateful every day that I get this opportunity.
I'm grateful that we had the chance to talk about what it is that you're doing in this fabulous province called Saskatchewan. And yes. I hope you get to keep doing it.
I do too, and I likewise hope that you get to keep telling stories, because you're part of this. You're part of this sort of ongoing crusade, if you will, to capture our stories here in Saskatchewan and to realize just how amazing we have it right here at home.
That's the plan.
Yes.
Great to chat with you again, Kristen.
You too, Kevin.
I'm glad you're doing so well.
Thank you.
And travel safely.
You too, in your LeSabre.
That's right. That's another topic of conversation we share. Yes. Is the conversation around the fabulous Buick LeSabre. Yep. Thank you so much, Kristen.
Thank you, Kevin.
Hey, thanks for listening. Music for SaskScapes is provided by Saskatchewan-born singer-songwriter Jeffrey Straker. It's so exciting to see SaskScapes being downloaded by a global audience. Remember, if you're in Saskatchewan and have a story that needs to be heard, contact me about how you can become a sponsor. Stories from our past and our present, they're all waiting to be told from here in the land of the living skies. So until next time...